Welcome back, everyone, to this second day at the Women's Solidarity and Ecology Conference. My name is Becky Artinian-Kaiser, and I'm the Associate Director of the Laudato Si Research Institute here at Campion Hall at the University of Oxford. Yesterday, we heard case studies from Amazonia, Zambia, and Malaysia. We explored topics in ecological economics and gained insight into the value of human rights perspectives for addressing women's vulnerabilities in contexts of environmental degradation. During our sessions today, we will be spotlighting issues in science and then in practice, followed by a keynote lecture from Professor Tony Bebbington. Now, if you are joining us for the first time today, I have a couple of housekeeping items to share with you. This conference is being held on Zoom webinars, so to participate in the dialogue, please post your questions for the panelists using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. The session chair will then select questions to put to the panelists. Closed captioning has also been enabled for the conference, so if you wish to turn on subtitles, please click the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen. Now, most sessions of the conference are being recorded and they will be made available to you following the conference. I am pleased now to hand over to Celia Deane-Drummond, who's the director of the Laudato Si Research Institute, who will be chairing the science panel session. Over to you, Celia.
Welcome, everybody, and it's a real pleasure to have a science panel in our conference, not least because I was a scientist for many years myself, and I know the value of scientific thinking in helping us to solve some of the greatest problems that we have on our planet. So the first speaker we're going to have in this panel is, I'm delighted to welcome her today, and that's Dr. Katarina Beryl, who's an environmental psychologist working at the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies of Potsdam in Germany. And the title of her talk is Barriers to a Collective Radical Ecological Conversion from a Psychological Perspective. Professor Myles and I will introduce after Dr. Beryl has spoken, because he's coming in a little bit later. So over to you, Katarina. Thank you so much.
The University of Oxford to look at the policy challenges of how to get the world to net zero beyond just how we can get ourselves to end our own contributions to global warming. And if I could just start off with a challenging picture, which is of a church in Greece, in the village of Antachori in Greece, which I think illustrates the challenge of stopping global warming rather graphically. This was a village where they discovered the village itself was built on lignite, on a particularly high carbon form of brown coal. And as you can see, they've literally dug the ground out from under the houses of the village in order to get at the brown coal, leaving only the church standing, which I think tells you, it illustrates two things that are very relevant to this meeting. First of all, it's the power of the incentives to use fossil fuels where we can. There's also the power of the church. The one thing that survived the discovery of the lignite was the church. And clearly that was the one thing that these villagers were reluctant to destroy in their quest for fossil fuels. But it also shows us that, you know, the need, this is a very poor part of Greece, I should stress. This is a part of Greece where there was very few other economic opportunities available. And these villagers literally couldn't afford not to dig the ground out from underneath their houses. And so that presents some of the really fundamental challenges we've got in front of us. If there are people in the world who can't afford not to use fossil fuels, those of us who can afford to not use fossil fuels, have an obligation to go beyond just reducing and eventually eliminating our own fossil fuel use, but also to address the emissions that will be caused by those sectors of the economy, those parts of the world, those sectors of society that can't afford to stop using fossil fuels at the rate that we can. And this is a sort of basic question that I think we need to ask ourselves in any of these meetings. How do we stop fossil fuels from causing global warming? So it's a more specific question than just how do we stop global warming, but very specifically, how do we stop fossil fuels themselves from causing global warming? And in the big picture, we know it's sort of emerged from the science very clearly. In order to stop global warming, we need to stop dumping carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And by the way, this schematic background I'm using here is brought in from the Oxford Net Zero logo, and it illustrates the sort of main points of any transition path to net zero. First of all, notice the atmosphere part, which I've highlighted here. It's the curve there illustrates the fact that it's the total area under the curve, the total amount of carbon dioxide that we dump in the atmosphere before we reach net zero, that will determine the peak warming we reach, the highest temperatures we reach. So we are now at about 1.2 degrees in the latest updates, 1.2 degrees above pre-industrial temperatures, warming at almost 1/4 degree per decade. So at that rate, we're going to be reaching 1.5 degrees in the early 2030s. That's sooner than we assessed, even in the IPCC 1.5 degrees report, which put our best estimate of that date at around 2040. I can explain why the date's been moved forward, but it shows how rapidly the world is warming at the moment, and the very small amount of time we have left to reduce net carbon dioxide emissions into the atmosphere to zero if we're going to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, which was the more ambitious goal set by the Paris Climate Agreement. And the reason we know we need to get net emissions to zero in order to achieve that goal is this figure from the last assessment of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which shows the total amount of carbon dioxide we dump in the atmosphere in the horizontal, and the black blob is where we were in the 2000s, moving up and to the right fairly rapidly. And in the 2000s, we were well below 1 degree. We're now over 1 degree, and we've released over 2,000 billion tons of CO2 into the atmosphere. So we're moving up along this orange plume. And the only way to stop us moving up the orange plume is to stop moving to the right. And by moving to the right, I mean adding more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So we need to limit the total amount of carbon dioxide we dump in the atmosphere, which is why everyone's talking about achieving net zero. Now, one of the things which has become abundantly clear is that we won't be able to reduce our emissions nearly fast enough just by reducing the overall production of carbon dioxide. We're too dependent on fossil fuels to rely on measures to reduce the production of carbon dioxide alone. And one of the best ways to complement emission reductions in the short term is through nature-based climate solutions, where we are restoring the carbon stored in the biosphere, restoring carbon taken up by forests, by mangroves, by peatlands, and so forth. Something close. It's not so much artificially adding carbon to the biosphere, but it's more restoring carbon to the biosphere that we have artificially removed from it, because we've actually depleted our global biospheric carbon stocks quite heavily already. So it's putting that carbon back where it belongs, if you like, and that would help us reduce emissions much faster in the short term. But This is clearly something which brings immediate benefits, not just to the climate, but to biodiversity, to ecosystem resilience, and so on. But there is a crucial proviso here. Nature takes time to take up carbon, and we have very limited time left. So although nature can contribute to meeting our climate goals, at the more ambitious end of our climate goals, it might contribute 1/10 of a degree or so to limit peak warming around mid-century. That was a result from a paper. This is a figure from a paper led by a colleague, Celia, published in Nature a couple of weeks ago, which showed the importance of time for nature-based climate solutions, which of course is a very important reason to get on with them, because it's going to take us time to start restoring carbon to the biosphere to compensate for some of the carbon we are continuing to produce by releasing it from the lithosphere by burning fossil fuels. But again, it also emphasizes that nature can help, but it's not the solution. But it can't be relied on to be the solution, in particular because, and this is a rather older figure, but a very important one, and one that people I think often forget, as we warm the world, many of our biosphere carbon sinks, many of the systems we currently rely on to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere turn into sources. They turn around and start to release that carbon back into the atmosphere just through the natural process of warming itself. And because of that, there's something inherently, there's inherent limits to how much we can rely on the biosphere to soak up the carbon dioxide we generate by burning fossil fuels. So when I see adverts like this in fuel stations telling you that you can drive carbon neutral by joining, other big fossil fuel companies are available, but this happens to be one that I had an image available for. But this particular company was sort of offering to protect and replant forests in order to offset the impact of your driving. And while many of the projects that company is supporting are undoubtedly very worthwhile, we mustn't fool ourselves into thinking that that's a permanent solution to continued use of fossil fuels. Eventually, stopping fossil fuels from causing global warming means putting the carbon dioxide they generate back underground. It means scaling up. And if we're going to continue to use engineered fossil fuel use, if we're going to continue to rely on engineered fossil fuel use, we're going to need engineered carbon dioxide disposal. It's sort of a like for like equation. The same engineering that's being used to extract fossil carbon from the ground is going to need to be used to put the carbon dioxide it generates back underground. This is certainly what happens in the scenarios where we actually meet the IPCC goals of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. We see a massive reduction in the total amount of carbon dioxide we produce from the burning of fossil fuels. You can see that by mid-century, we've reduced our total amount of carbon dioxide produced from burning fossil fuels by a factor of 2/3 or so, but we're nowhere near zero. And the rest of it is taken care of by, so we're burning a lot less through replacing fossil energy sources with renewables and so forth, but we're also storing a great deal more back underground. So that's in the big picture, we're going to see over this century a transition on a very large scale to ensure that our continued engineered use of fossil fuels, our continued uses of fossil fuels around the world are balanced by engineered disposal of the carbon dioxide it generates. And this is obviously a very long way from the kind of behavior changes we can individually do. We can't dispose of CO2 ourselves. You need a big industrial company to do that. But we can put pressure on both the companies that we purchase from and the governments we vote for to transition to safe use of fossil fuels, as opposed to simply using fossil fuels and dumping the carbon dioxide they generate into the atmosphere. And that's the you know, what as an ethical challenge we have to grasp. It's that transition we need to ensure that we don't just do less ourselves, but we also apply pressure to the system we're working within, that we're buying within, that we're voting within, to make continued use of fossil fuels consistent with no further global warming. Many people would like us to simply stop using fossil fuels altogether. One day we will, that I can assure you, but I don't know when, and I'm pretty confident it will be too late for the climate if we simply wait for the world to stop using fossil fuels altogether. So we have to stop fossil fuels from causing global warming before the world stops using fossil fuels. And that very simple fact has some rather profound implications for climate policy, which I think we're only starting to begin to grapple with today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Really fascinating paper, and I mean, I'm going to encourage now the participants in the audience to ask some questions, but maybe I have one to kick us off, specifically to Myles, if we can, for the first 10 minutes or so, and that is this: if your argument's right, and I think that I am convinced by it, because it's impossible to change people's behavior overnight, even if we go for radical ecological conversion.
Actually, can I just briefly interrupt you? It's possible to change your behavior overnight.
Yeah.
But it's impossible to change everybody, and arguably wrong to change everybody else's behavior overnight. So
sure.
It's a very delicate one, that, because I think
okay.
But sorry, Celia.
Right. Yeah. No, I'm talking about collectives rather than individuals. When I'm talking about behavioural change, which is what you were suggesting, I think.
Absolutely.
That's the collective that we need to go for. But you also mentioned pressure on governments. Now, what I want to know is whether the governments are actually talking about this, or whether that's because I haven't seen governments specifically grappling it in the way you've suggested. So it would be difficult for us to put pressure on governments if there isn't actually the policy in place to make those kinds of changes. So I wonder if you could just elaborate a little bit more on that.
Well, you know, I don't hear environmentally conscious citizens asking ministers, why isn't a fossil fuel company obliged to dispose of its carbon dioxide and that generated by its products in the same way that, for example, a company that sells you a fridge is required to take the fridge back and dispose of it properly when at the end of its life? Because I mean, that's the way the law works actually in both the UK and Europe. Companies have a responsibility for the environmental impact of their products even after they've been sold. So I don't hear that question being asked, and I think it should be asked, because I don't think politicians have a very good answer to it. And I actually think, and this where I may start to sound a little bit sort of paranoid, but I think some paranoia is justifiable in this, that the industry has done a remarkably good job about making the conversation about consumer behavior. And you know, there's so much of the climate conversation is about individual consumer decisions that we're letting the industry off the hook. And the industry is sort of sitting in the corner saying, well, you know, we're just selling the product. We're just providing for the market need. It's up to people whether they decide whether to drive their cars or not. And I think that's what they need to be challenged on. So you know, because I think for the vast majority of the world, our choices are pretty limited in terms of, you know, those of us fortunate enough to live in Oxford, we've got excellent public transport opportunities. We don't need to drive cars, and we can probably afford to drive electric cars if we have to. But you know, for the vast majority of the world, options are much more restricted. Whereas for these companies, these are the richest some of the richest companies in the world. I mean, they're 10% of the world economy. They have got options. They've got choices. They could start moving in this direction, but they can't do it alone. They won't do it alone, because any single company that starts doing this is just going to make its products more expensive, and the chief executive just gets fired and they get a new chief executive. I mean, so you know, they need governments to push them all together in this direction, but it could be done.
Yeah, I mean, something that I'm sure would be helpful to raise at the COP26 in Glasgow is a matter
I
of
do
urgency.
think, I absolutely, I do think, and a huge result for me at COP would be for a politician or sort of a thought leader in some ways, just to put the fossil fuel industry on the spot, to say, you know, how is it that you're selling this product and not taking responsibility for what it's doing? And we're seeing this already, and in that, you know, both Shell and BP have come up with notional net zero plans. When you drill into them, I pointed out that the Shell one, both of them are very heavily based on just we're going to plant trees to compensate for continued use of fossil fuels. And that doesn't actually add up. I mean, one company could do it, but they can't both do it because there isn't enough space for the trees. So you know, they need pressing on that. So, but it is progress in the sense they've acknowledged they need to answer the question, even if they haven't actually produced a very good answer yet. So perhaps we're getting somewhere.
Yeah. Okay. I've got a lot of questions now coming up for you. So here's one. CCS, that's carbon capture, presumably seems to be more speculative as a solution right now, and some would say is techno-optimist or unrealistic, techno-salvation. Is it not dangerous to frame the transition to net zero with such a view, and how realistic do you think this is, and what data is being used to base the particular view?
So just to be clear, I think it's the industry in selling its products is relying on this technology happening. So it's not my optimism, it's the optimism of the industry and of all of us who use its products, which is all of us at the moment. It's almost impossible to live an entirely fossil-free life at the moment. This optimism is there regardless, but what worries me is it's just optimism. They're not being put on the spot and required to demonstrate that it works, which is why I argue that they should be required to dispose of CO2 as a condition for continuing to sell it. And that way we'd really discover how much this costs. We know that it's possible. I mean, absolutely, you know, it's basic geology, and also you know, the industry's been doing it for decades on a very small scale compared to what the scale in which they need to do it. But we certainly know it's possible. What we don't know is what it would add to the cost of their products. You know, would it add, you know, 100? Some optimists say it might add only $100 to in terms of cost of a barrel of oil. Which is something familiar to people rather than the cost of a ton of CO2. Some optimists say it might add only $30 or $40 to the cost of a barrel of oil, which would be, you know, remarkably cheap. Others say it might add well over $100 to the cost of a barrel of oil to get rid of the CO2 associated with that barrel entirely. Obviously, there's a big range there. We're not going to find out that cost until the industry is actually required to do it. Which is, in my view, the reason for getting on with it, because, you know, the sooner we find out what it's going to cost, the better, because we're relying on it.
Yes, I mean, you know, the related question really is about how much energy does it take in itself to conduct it at scale. Presumably, this is all factored in anyway when you're designing this technology.
Yes, I mean, it does take energy, and therefore, and that's most of the, and that's the point. But these are energy providing companies, so they've got the energy. But that's again why I would like to turn this around and say it's up to them. It's up to them to get rid of the CO2. If they want to sell fossil fuels, they need to get rid of the CO2 associated with the use of those fossil fuels. And if they discover cheap ways of doing that, and that barely affects the price of their products, well, good for them. I doubt they will, to be honest, because it's an inherently difficult thing to do. It's probably going to make their products a lot more expensive, and that'll probably mean we'll use a great deal less of them. So it's very important to emphasize this isn't a get out of jail free card at all. In fact, it's a get out of jail very expensively card. But it does at least get us out of jail.
Yes, and I mean it's pushing them to take more responsibility instead of just dumping their responsibilities onto the individuals buying the product. So
yes,
I think you're right. And another question here is, last week there was a landmark court case in the Netherlands, and Shell was ordered by the court to cut its carbon emissions by 45% by 2030 based on 2019 levels. Is that a way to go when the governments fail?
I think, yeah, that landmark indeed. That was a huge court case, and I mean, it's under appeal, of course. Who knows what will actually happen? But I think it will stand. It will still stand as a landmark, even if it's overturned on appeal, because it shows that the courts are scrutinizing companies' plans on this and just saying, look, come on, they don't even stack up. So, one way in which Shell would be able to comply with that court ruling would be for Shell to start doing something like this, start getting rid of the CO2 associated with the use of its products. Of course, that would immediately put Shell at a disadvantage compared to other companies that are not subject to a similar court ruling. So I would say then immediately, to be fair, the courts should be taking on all the other oil companies as well, and more power to them. Maybe they will. But that is definitely a way it needs to go. But we eventually, the courts aren't going to let governments off the hook here. In the end, we need consistent regulation of the entire industry. The courts can push it along, but it doesn't let politicians off the hook. They're going to have to grasp the nettle and just say, no, we've got to regulate this industry. And of course, in many countries, the industry remains, including the UK, the industry remains an important source of revenue for the government. It remains very powerful. And it's quite difficult there, and also generates a lot of jobs. And it's actually very difficult for governments, therefore, to step up and regulate it.
And that's particularly the case, isn't it, in poorer communities which don't necessarily have good government regulation. And there's another question here about regulation as well. So do you think the recommendations of the Committee on Climate Change have been taken on board enough, and how much more do you think can be done?
So first of all, I think the recommendations of the Committee on Climate Change show the UK that it would be perfectly possible to meet our objective. And in fact, it wouldn't even be particularly expensive for the UK to meet our objective of achieving net zero in 2050. But my personal assessment, and I think that's Shad, I think we're going to see a new report coming out from the Committee on Climate Change, a kind of scorecard on how the government's doing at the moment. And I think at the moment we're doing well on aspirational noises, less well on action. So I think the committee's recommendations definitely show us the way to go, but we still got to do it. We still got to get on with it.
Mm-hmm. And probably have time for one more brief question. Michael Mann, in his new book, The New Climate Wars, is very skeptical of techno fixes instead of stopping to emit carbon, although I think you're saying that you don't want to stop emitting. But so what measures do you support to close the gap, and what's your sense of Mann's urging not to believe that science is going to save us? So that's, I guess, the risk of some of these
I think,
technologies.
Yeah, no, I think anybody who's advocating a technology that somebody else is going to pay for, I think is on pretty weak ground. So, the industry is all too good at saying, yes, we can capture and dispose of CO2. Oh, but we need the government to pay for it because it's not economic otherwise. So if you're counting on a technology, you need to be putting money into it. And that's where we need to sort of hold the industry to account. So I think, the question is not, will it work? In very much like the question of, when will oil run out? That was never really an interesting question. The question was more, how much will it cost to get more oil? I mean, what's going to happen to the cost of finding more? And so the interesting question is not, can we dispose of CO2? But the question is, how much is it going to cost to do that? And therefore, how much will we actually want to generate CO2 when we have to dispose of it properly, as opposed to just dumping it in the atmosphere? And that's, you know, an unresolved question, and it's not going to be resolved until we actually require people to get rid of CO2 instead of just using the atmosphere as a fly tip, which is what we're doing at the moment.
Yeah, really, really interesting. So thank you so much. Do you have time for any more questions, or do you want to?
I'm really sorry. I just got a message to
yeah, all right. Okay, so we're really grateful. I think it's been really stimulating and something for us to all think about.
Yeah, I'm sorry it had to be so brief.
Don't worry. Thank you.
Yeah.